Welcome to our first Conservation Conversations. It's an opportunity for us at Zoos Victoria to share our incredible stories with you. You know, while the world has got a bit crazy and different, we're still open. Well, not to the public, but we still have a job to do here at Zoos Victoria. Every day our keepers are still coming in. They're looking after our animals, giving them the highest levels of care. But what few people are thinking of is that our conservationists are still out in the field. We're still doing the incredible conservation work that we do day in and day out, through snow, through sleet, and in hailstorms. And it's a delight to be able to share that with you through these webinars. Today's critters you're going to hear about are the Mountain Pygmy-possum. These adorable little balls of fluff live high up in the mountains and hibernate under the snow. If you want to work with Mountain Pygmy-possums, you've got to be flexible, adaptable, and have really good outdoor clothing, because you never know what the elements are going to throw to you. And so tonight you're in for a treat listening to Dr. Marissa Parrott talk about Mountain Pygmy-possums, and she's joined by Darcie Carruthers, who works on the human side of saving Mountain Pygmy-possums. And I think they're going to be an incredible combination. I know you're going to enjoy these conversations, because these conversations just open up and share with you some of the incredible conservation work we're doing. And this work is only possible because of your support. And so it's a treat for us to share it with you. We hope you enjoy it, and we hope you keep coming back for more. There's a whole lot of these talks happening over the next couple of weeks, and we look forward to seeing you in all of them.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first of Zoos Victoria's Conservation Conversations, a webinar series to keep you connected to your zoos. I'm Darcie, and I'm one of the conservation campaigners at Zoos Victoria, live streaming to you from my spare bedroom. And I'm joined here tonight by my lovely colleague, Dr. Marissa Parrott. Hey, Marissa.
Hi, Darce. How are you tonight?
I'm really well. How are you going?
Really, really good. Thank you.
That's good. Marissa, do you want to kick us off just by telling us quickly a little bit about your role and what you do at Zoos Victoria?
Sure. So I'm the reproductive biologist at Zoos Victoria, working in the wildlife conservation and science team. So I'm really lucky to work across all three of our zoo properties, with everything from frogs through to lions. But the majority of my work is with animals like the eastern barred bandicoot, native rodents like smoky mice and New Holland mice, Tassie devils, and of course the mountain pygmy possum I've worked on for coming up to about 14 years now. So I get to work out in the field as well, which is a lot of fun. I have my dream job.
You have a lot of people's dream jobs, I think. So everyone, for the next 50 to 60 minutes or so, Marissa and I have the pleasure of your company to talk in conversation about one of Australia's cutest and certainly most fascinating animals, the mountain pygmy-possum. Marissa will share some of her first-hand stories of working with these animals and of her time spent in their alpine habitats. We will also explain how mountain pygmy-possums are inextricably intertwined with a rather unassuming but incredible species of moth. And we'll also let you know how you can support Zoos Victoria and our partners to protect this possum in the snow. So the tone of this evening is going to be very relaxed, very cash. If you haven't already, please grab yourselves a cup of tea like we have, or pour yourselves a glass of wine and settle in. And as you do that, the most important thing I'd like to acknowledge is that wherever we're tuning in from this evening, we are on Aboriginal lands. Marissa and I are joining you from two different locations on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, lands that were never ceded, and we would both like to acknowledge that. We'd also like to pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and particularly acknowledge any of you joining us this evening who may be Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders. Thanks for being here. And just quickly, before we get deep into conversation, please note that this is meant to be interactive. So you can post questions and comments using the Q&A function. If you can see that Q&A icon, it's just on the right of your screen there. Click on that and type in your questions and comments. Marissa and I will set some time aside at the end and do our best to answer some of your questions. So please type them in as they come to you throughout the evening. So with that said, let's begin our conservation conversation, and who better to kick us off than Dr. Marissa Parrott. And Marissa, can you start us off by telling us a little bit about that framed picture we can see on the wall behind you there?
I can. So I have loved mountain pygmy-possums since I was a little girl. Back when I was about 10 years old, my family went skiing at Mount Hotham. And my uncle bought my cousin and me this poster that you can see behind me that I've had framed on my wall ever since. So I was really fascinated by this unique and amazing species. And I'm just going to start screen sharing so I can bring up some photos of them for you. I'll just check, Darcie. Perfect.
Yes,
so everyone should be able to see that. That's always a good sign. And anyone who wants to increase the size of that screen and that picture, you can do that by hovering your mouse over the middle. You should find a slider there, and that will let you increase the size of the image you're looking at. So given I was always fascinated by this species, after I finished my PhD on female mate choice in marsupials, I was absolutely thrilled to be invited to join the Mountain Pygmy-possum recovery team, who were starting a new program with a captive breeding group at Healesville Sanctuary. And so after I went to the recovery team meetings, I was even more excited to receive a phone call from Healesville Sanctuary offering me a job as a mountain pygmy-possum keeper and researcher. And my first pygmy-possum love at Healesville was a little old fellow named Jerry. So this is little Jerry. In the wild, mountain pygmy-possums can live to 12 for females, although generally they only live up to about 4 years old. And males can live to 5, though generally they live for about 1 to 2 years. Little Jerry was 9. So he was quite an ancient fellow, a little bit deaf, but he did really important behaviours called nut caching or food caching. That's where he stored extra food around his bed and in other places for those times over winter when you might need an extra snack. Now, of course, with our program at Healesville, he was getting food every day, and so sometimes his nuts started to look a little bit older, and I'd sneak in when he was asleep and remove the nuts and replace them with nice new ones. So Jerry probably thought he had the best entry of any mountain pygmy-possum in history. That was until one day he caught me. I was removing half a walnut and he woke up and he saw me taking it away from him. And the look on his face, I'll never forget it, put his tiny little pink paws up as if to say, "Why? I thought you were my friend." And so I went and I chose the largest, juiciest, nicest half a walnut you've ever seen to give back to him. And when I checked on him later before I went home, there he was, curled up asleep in a ball, cuddling his walnut like a teddy bear. And this is really important to maintain these behaviours around things like food storage and also hibernation. So mountain pygmy-possums are Australia's only hibernating mammals, spending about 5 to 7 months asleep under the snow every year. And out of interest, those two on my hand there fast asleep are actually Jerry's nephews, Frodo and Sam. So the possums live in these very cold areas. I'm there with the team. This was actually in November. So those cold areas can last a long time. And it's important that possums put on enough weight to hibernate. So they enjoy their food and they can more than double their weight coming up to hibernation in autumn, eating natural seeds and nuts. They can get up to about 80 grams, or if you're like little Bev up at Healesville, 88.7, the bigger the better. And then over the hibernation period, they lose half of that weight and they can drop as low as 35 or 40 grams. They wake up in spring to find a smorgasbord of their favourite foods like bogong moths, and this is the time when they meet to breed. This is one of our females with her 4 young. Females can have up to 4 babies in a litter, And big marsupials, they have a very short pregnancy. I think they're a lot smarter than we are. They're pregnant for just 13 days. And they give birth to something the size of a tic-tac. So much more clever than we are. They can also have litters with more than one father. So females will mate with 2 males, for example, and then both of those males will sire young in her litters. So a single litter can have half-siblings in it and multiple fathers. Now, mountain pygmy possums are found in a very distinct type of habitat, which is shown on this slide here, and that is boulder fields up in the alpine zone. In fact, there are only mammal in Australia found exclusively in the alpine zone in 3 areas. They're found in New South Wales at Mount Kosciuszko, in Victoria at Mount Buller, and also around the Bogong High Plains in places like Falls Creek and Mount Hotham. Now, unfortunately, for a long time, people didn't realise mountain pygmy possums were there. In fact, until 1966, they were only known from the fossil record and they were believed to be extinct. They were refound actually in a ski lodge at Mount Hotham, and then they weren't found at Mount Buller until the 1990s. By that stage, there had been some habitat destruction to make way for things like infrastructure and roads. And so the teams out in these areas do a huge amount of work to rebuild those boulders and to replant tens of thousands of trees out there to try and get that habitat nice for the possums. Other threats out in the wild include introduced predators like cats and the foxes you can see here. So again, our partners like Parks Victoria do a huge amount trying to control these threats for the possums. Another threat to mountain pygmy possums in the wild is a changing climate. Things like fire is becoming a lot more prevalent, a lot more frequent, and a lot stronger. This is one of the boulder fields where I've been lucky to work, and you can see over the top of it what look like white skeletons. And these are, in a way, they're the white skeletons of the Pimelia and the Podocarpus bushes and shrubs that should grow over the boulders, but were burnt back in 2006. So 14 years later, this amazing boulder field habitat is still trying to recover. It's a very delicate area. A changing climate and warming areas can also cause problems for hibernation. So the possums, as I said, will sleep under the snow over winter, and they need a very stable temperature. They go deep into the boulders and they make beautiful nests out of things like moss where they can sleep, and they need it to stay at about 2 to 3 degrees so they can drop their metabolism, they can drop their temperature, and they can hibernate. If you don't have a nice thick blanket of snow, unfortunately that temperature fluctuates. You can't hibernate properly, and then those possums are less likely to survive the winter. Another issue is, of course, something like drought and how it can affect the food sources for the possums in their boulder field area, like the seeds and the nuts, and also further afield with their main food source in spring, the bogong moth, which we're going to talk about more tonight. So there's a huge amount of work happening for mountain pygmy possums, and much of this is with the Mountain Pygmy-possum recovery team and our partners. So the recovery team is a very dedicated group of people from government, from alpine resort management boards, land managers, scientists and others who have come together to protect the mountain pygmy possum and recover the possum and its habitat. And you'll see me talk about some of our wonderful partners tonight. At Healesville Sanctuary, of course, one of our main focuses is our captive breeding program, and we've now produced 120 mountain pygmy possum babies, in fact more than that, including new 7 babies produced just this year, and you can see them in that picture there. Our main focus for our breeding program is research and advocacy, raising awareness and love for this beautiful animal. To do this, we have specially designed enclosures, and you can see those at the bottom of the slide. They don't look like much from the outside, but inside they look very different. They have climbing structures and rock walls, even little waterfalls for the mountain pygmy possums, so we can care for them. But a really important thing that those enclosures do is they mimic the alpine environment. So the lighting changes across the year, just as it does with the sunshine. being shorter in winter and longer in summer. We can also change the temperature. So over winter, it's down to about 2.5 degrees. So it's really cold and we wear snowsuits to go in and care for the possums. Over summer, it's in the mid-teens, mimicking what happens out in the alpine zone, and that's a lot nicer to be able to work somewhere air-conditioned over our hot summers. And this is the kind of work that we can do long-term with big thanks to our donors and our partners and our members. You can see up there one of the nest boxes that the possums sleep in, and a beautiful nest that's been made out of moss, as they do in the wild, and of course some nut and seed caching there in a bed, just as we spoke about with Jerry. We also have possums in outdoor enclosures, so you can see here one of our outdoor group enclosures and our keeper Paula up the back. They have boulders and tunnels, alpine plants like the Pimelia and Podocarpus, so that the possums can use these to keep up their fitness, and we also use them as pre-release enclosures. And we do research about things like mate choice. So that's letting a female choose which male she'd like to be paired with so we can have the best young possible. So that little enclosure shows 5 lots of scents from males. That's bedding they've been hibernating in. And we choose the males that we think are genetically suitable for the females, and then give her her choice for about 10 minutes. And she'll go through, as you can see on the side there, and sniff those. We measure how long she spends with them, how many times she visits them, and what the behaviours are. So sometimes the females will pick the scents up and rub them on themselves. They'll groom next to them, they'll scent mark, they'll look for the males. And in fact, we've had some females who couldn't decide between 2, so they grabbed both lots of bedding and held onto it and even took it back to their nests with them. And we've shown that females who like those males and are then grouped with them are more likely to have youngsters with those males. Another really exciting thing that we did back in 2013 was our first release of Mountain Pygmy-possums out to the wild. So you can see one of our little possums here wearing a tiny radio tracking collar. It weighs just 1.2 grams, and you can see how teensy that is compared with people's fingernails. We released the possums in their familiar nest boxes and in groups so they'd know someone out there. They didn't actually keep those nest boxes and keep using them. They just came back to steal the food and then disappeared off, as you can see happening in the back here, to go and meet the wild possums, which was great. And one of my favourite photos that we had from our infrared cameras that we had out there in the wild is shown just here. It's a little bit hard to see, but very quickly after leaving his nest box for the first time, this little male caught his first bogong moth to eat. And that made us really happy to know that they were out there eating that food and meeting new wild possums. We radio tracked the possums for over a month, looking at where they went, where they hibernated or where they nested. And then we caught them using these Elliott small live mammal traps. So the possums run in, step on a treadle, and the trap closes safely behind them. There's food in there to keep them happy, and also some nice soft fluff you can just see to snuggle down in. We looked at their weights, we looked at their health and their reproductive status, and then we took their collars off and let them go. And some of the positives that came out of that project were that there was really high survival of those possums, and all of the females we released had babies out there in the wild. And so you can see some of those babies in the pouch here. And if you look really closely, you can even see tiny little fingers on a hand right in the middle. Other work that we've been really proud to be involved in has been with our partners at Mount Hotham Alpine Resort Management Board and the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, or DELP. So this is the start of the Tunnel of Love. Now, mountain pygmy possums do a really interesting thing. The males travel down through the boulders and hibernate at a lower elevation or lower down on the mountain than the females. And then, after hibernation, they travel back up the mountain to meet the females to hopefully breed and create more baby possums. Unfortunately, there's a great alpine road in the middle of those boulder fields, and that made it really hard for the males to travel. And they had to go up on the road where they're exposed to issues like cars, introduced predators, owls, and other issues. So working with Mount Hotham and DELP, we looked at a new Tunnel of Love back in 2018, and that involved great overview from Hotham to remove part of the Great Alpine Road, put in these culverts filled with boulders, and that meant the possums could safely travel through the boulders underneath the road without coming up to the top where the threats are. So you can see the boulders on either side of the road here that was specially created, and there are also wonderful little microchip scanners and cameras in the tunnels so we can see which animals are moving and when. Now, there has been a massive amount of work done out there with our partners, but a few years ago we realised there was another big problem looming, and that was with the main food source. So our partners in the wild through Ecology Links and the recovery team started to see fewer moths. Usually around 4 billion moths or more arrive up in the alpine zone every spring, which Darcie's going to talk about a bit later. But in the spring of 2017 and 2018, the moths were nearly undetectable, and that amazing swarm and fluttering of wings fell silent. This was a major concern for the moths, but also for the animals in the alpine zone, because when the moths arrive, it's the second biggest influx of nutrients into the area after the sun. That meant that there wasn't the food arriving for the possums coming out of hibernation. And our partners found that across the Victorian monitored populations, over 50% of females in 2018 lost all of their babies. And in fact, in the worst affected population, it was 95% of the females. And so this was a real concern for the possums and for the moths. And I'd like to show you what a normal moth night, in fact, it's a bit of a light on moth night actually looks like from 2013. So if we can play the moth video now, that would be great. Thank you. So you can see actually a quiet night here. These are moths in my headlights, and there are times where you can't even see really in front of your face. Huge numbers of moths, and this is what it should look like. And so it was a real shock, I think, for people to realise just how much the moths had decreased in the last 2 years. It was quite unprecedented. And so that was a major concern because across the possums range, there are only around 2,000 of them left, and they are listed as critically endangered through the IUCN Red List. So we started talking with, of course, the recovery team, with our partners and back at Zoos Victoria about what we might be able to do to help these moths and these possums. And very early on at the zoos, we realised that this was a great area to bring in the general public and a great area to work with people like Darcie on campaigns.
Thanks, Marissa. I'm going to take over from here and tell you a little bit about that campaign side and how we got people involved with mountain pygmy possums and bogong moths. So I'm just going to try to share my screen. Bear with me. Okay, can you see that image?
Yes, that's looking good, Darcie. You're good to go.
Excellent, thank you. So as Marissa touched on, bogong moths are an incredibly important food source for mountain pygmy possums. When the possums wake up from their winter hibernation, hungry for their first meal in months, the spring arrival of the bogong moths in Victoria's alpine zone provides their little bodies with the nutritional boost that they need for the breeding season. These are the types of scenes, like the one you see on your screen, that mountain pygmy possums should wake up to. Scores of bogong moths arriving in the Alpine National Park, filling the air and laying one on top of each other like roof tiles, lining the surfaces of caves, and even crowding into the crevices of the boulder fields, ready for the hungry mountain pygmy possums to devour them. As I've heard Marissa say many times, bogong moths are just like hamburgers on wings for mountain pygmy possums. But as she mentioned a few years ago, those hamburgers on wings all but disappeared. In the summer of 2017 and again in 2018, the numbers of migrating bogong moths collapsed from an estimated 4.4 billion to almost undetectable numbers. And we'll get to the reasons behind that shortly. But first, I'd like to chat a bit more about the moths themselves. And if you're not already in love with bogong moths, like I am, you will be by the end of this talk. Depending on where you grew up, some of you might have your own memories of bogong moths, and we'd love for you to share them with us in the Q&A function, the chat there. Having grown up in Sydney, I have distinct childhood memories of the occasional swarm of bogong moths being blown off course and descending on the city. They'd flutter around outside lights and batter themselves up against window panes and gather together in door frames. Some of you might even remember when the bogong moths made international headlines for crashing the Sydney Olympics in the year 2000 and landing on singer Yvonne Kenny as she sang the Olympic hymn at the closing ceremony. Or even when they reportedly forced Elton John off stage at one of his concerts here in Victoria, which apparently he still hates them for. So for many of us, bogong moths are a part of our lived experience and part of the ecological and cultural heritage of southeastern Australia. And that's certainly no truer for anyone than for some of this land's first people. For thousands of years, the annual migration of bogong moths has been an important part of culture for Aboriginal people of various nations across the southeast of the continent. Oral histories and early European accounts talk of hundreds of people from nations such as Wiradjuri, Walgaloo and Ngunnawal gathering at bogong moth estivation sites around areas that we call today the Snowy Mountains in New South Wales, the Brindabellas in the ACT, and even further south in the Victorian Alps. In these locations, the men would harvest bogong moths, scraping them off vertical walls in the fissures in the granite rocks, or even using smouldering bushes to smoke the moths from the caves, causing them to fall to the floor where they'd be collected on a stretched kangaroo skin or a finely woven fibre net. Bogong moths are reportedly about 60% fat by dry weight and about 27% protein, and apparently they taste sweet and walnut-like, although I haven't tried them myself. Many accounts refer to them as a relished food that people were able to harvest and eat for weeks at a time, emerging fatter and healthier looking following this great annual feast. So for many people, bogong moths play an important role in their cultural, social, and even culinary heritage. Others of us may have taken them for granted for the huge numbers that they once appeared in, or even found them unpleasant or annoying. But I hope I've managed to briefly touch on the fact that bogong moths are so much more than just possum food. They really are a part of this land's history and ecology. Another reason why bogong moths are such amazing animals is that they are extraordinary long-distance navigators. With a body length of only around 25 to 35 centimetres measuring head to wingtip, and a brain much smaller than the size of a grain of rice, bogong moths are able to travel over 1,000 kilometres. Each year, bogong moths make their way from their breeding grounds in southeastern Queensland and central and northern New South Wales, the alpine areas of southern New South Wales and Victoria. What's even more incredible is that they do this return journey every year, and they navigate most of it at night. The bogong moths first leave their breeding grounds around spring when the temperature starts to heat up. They escape the impending hotter months by heading south, past the summer in the cool crevices and caves of southeastern Australia's alpine area. Flying to the west of the Great Dividing Range, they undertake most of this journey under the cover of darkness at night time. There's currently a lot of great work going into understanding exactly how bogong moths navigate this epic journey, particularly by scientists at Australian National University in Canberra and at the Vision Group at Lund University in Sweden. And the current thinking is that they are able to use the stars and the moon as visual compass cues and hone their direction by sensing the Earth's magnetic field. But as we mentioned earlier, in the summers of 2017 and again in 2018, this epic nocturnal migration barely arrived. With uncertainty abounding as to what the summer of 2019 would bring, Zoos Victoria and our partners knew that we needed to involve the community in the intertwined plight of bogong moths and mountain pygmy-possums. So first, we looked at the complex cocktail of threats facing bogong moths. Much of their breeding grounds in Queensland and in New South Wales was suffering from terrible and prolonged drought. And it is also thought that agricultural pesticides play their part in killing bogong moth larvae. But for those that do make it to becoming moths, they have to contend with light pollution and its effects on their ability to use those visual cues in the night sky to navigate their ancient nocturnal journey. The recent bushfires over the summer are also thought to be likely to exacerbate some of these challenges facing bogong moths. But the human-made threatening process that we thought we might be able to do something about was light pollution. So I'm going to talk a little bit further about that one. Looking at this map, you can see light pollution generated by urban areas throughout southeastern Australia. The warmer the colour, the brighter the light, and this is what bogong moths have to contend with along their journey. Bogong moths can become distracted by artificial light, drawn off course and even trapped in their glow, preventing them from continuing on their journey further south towards hungry mountain pygmy-possums. One area that is located directly along the bogong moth flight path, and that with all of its brightly lit public buildings and infrastructure certainly punches above its weight in terms of light emissions, is the city of Canberra. Perhaps the best documented building in Canberra and even the country for its relationship with bogong moths is none other than Parliament House. Pictured on the left of your screen is an image of New Parliament House in the year that it opened in 1988. And all of those black splodgy marks that you can see around the windows are bogong moths. It's been reported that over the course of the 32-year history of this building, swarms of bogong moths have regularly visited and even wrought havoc on Parliament House. The swarm in 1988 is reported to have clogged the building's air conditioning ducts, and the Sydney Morning Herald reported in 2007 that bogong moths had several times set off the fire alarms in the Senate. The Parliament of Australia even used to have its own bogong moth research brief, in which operational recommendations were made to decrease such pesky events from occurring. It contains one section entitled Parliament House as a Moth Trap, and I quote, "Parliament House, built on Capitol Hill with its elevated floodlit flagpole and extensive lighting, disrupts the flight of the moths and acts as a giant trap for moths migrating through Canberra during October and November. The moths treat the building as a temporary camp, and it is often necessary to reduce the building's lighting to allow the moths to continue their migration south." Here, you can see clear evidence of that light trap that we're referring to. This here is a long exposure image of birds predating on a swarm of bogong moths caught in that trap above the flagpole of Parliament House. So turning lights off is exactly what we asked people to do. The campaign Lights Off for the Bogong Moths was born, and our target audiences included local, state and territory, and federal governments, who we called on to turn off unnecessary outdoor lights during the bogong moth migration period. We also called on individuals to turn off any unnecessary outdoor lights at their homes within this geographic range and during this time period. There's a lovely video by our comms team that tells this story much better than I will, so please play the video. Some of you may have seen that animation before, but I don't think you can see it too many times. It's just a beautiful, beautiful video. I'm going to share my screen again and hop back into our presentation. You see that, Marissa?
Yes, you're good to go, Darcie.
Excellent. So the response to this was fantastic. We put up a billboard outbound from Canberra Airport to capture the nation's politicians from across a large geographic range. And we were delighted to have a flood of letters come in from MPs across New South Wales and Victoria and ministers from the ACT letting us know that they were turning off and reducing lights at public buildings. Although we didn't succeed in our aim of having the lights turned off at Parliament House, the Federal Environment Minister herself did share the Lights Off for the Moths message on social media. So that was fantastic. And one of our fabulous donors even shared her contacts and got us in touch with the Finnish embassy in Canberra. They were generous enough to turn off all their unnecessary outdoor lights throughout the bogong moth migration period. And this set a really important precedent to reduce the light pollution coming from within the incredibly brightly lit diplomatic ring of embassies and high commissions that surround Parliament House at Yarralumla. So huge thanks to her for putting us in touch with the Finnish embassy. Our second call to action with the community was to citizen scientists and mobilling southeastern Australians as moth detectives. We needed to know if bogong moths were going to make their way down to Victoria. So together with our fantastic collaborators at Federation Uni's Centre for E-Research and Digital Innovation, Moth Tracker was created. This is a platform to register a moth sighting and help the critically endangered mountain pygmy-possum. Moth Tracker is hosted on the SWIFT network or the statewide integrated Flora and Fauna Team's website. On the day that it launched, we all waited with bated breaths at Zoos Victoria to see if anyone out there would upload a moth sighting. We couldn't have asked for more when on the day that it launched in September 2019, Moth Tracker received its very first moth sighting from citizen scientist Austin in Ararat, right here in Victoria. And what's more, Austin's moth was a bogong moth. And we started to see bogong moth and other moth sightings flooding in from all over the country, as you can see populating the map here. And I'd love to know if any of you listening tonight submitted a moth sighting, so please let us know, and thank you if you did. Of these sightings, about 45% were of different moth species, such as that beautiful southern old lady moth that you can see in the top left of your screen there. About 25% of the records were entertaining but unverifiable moth images. And most importantly, some 30% were of verified bogong moths. While this was really, really exciting, most of the records being submitted to Moth Tracker were of individual animals. And this was really concerning for a species that usually undergoes mass migration in the billions. It wasn't until mid-October that citizen scientist Jody uploaded this image to Moth Tracker. Pictured here is a verified image of a swarm of bogong moths around the chairlift at Mount Hotham Ski Resort. And I can tell you that the mood in the office at Zoos Victoria on that day was one of relief and excitement and pure happiness that at least some of the bogong moths had made it to where they should be. And importantly, we were able to share this citizen scientist provided information with relevant scientists in the field. Another wonderful and somewhat unexpected highlight from the month of October for Moth Tracker was this sighting of a wild mountain pygmy-possum. This was snapped and uploaded to Moth Tracker by New South Wales threatened species expert Dr. Linda Broom from the boulder fields of the Snowy Mountains Kosciuszko National Park. So what did we achieve in all of this community engagement? Well, by the end of the target period, Moth Tracker had received over 500 moth sightings from 7 out of Australia's 8 states and territories. So this took us well beyond Zoos Victoria's usual geographical sphere of influence. Also, our amazing marketing and communications team secured unprecedented reach through nationally syndicated TV, radio, and print media, reaching an audience of almost 2.9 million Australians to raise awareness about bogong moths, mountain pygmy-possums, and what we can all do to help them. And finally, Zoos Victoria's Senior Social Science Research Manager, Emily McLeod, conducted baseline surveys pre-campaign and follow-up surveys post-campaign to understand what influence, if any, we'd had in the particularly important target region of the ACT. And we were really happy to see increases in these measurements. 9.6% increase in the recognition of bogong moths by viewing an image of the species. A 7.8% increase in ability to correctly identify mountain pygmy-possums. A 10.7% increase in the identification of reducing light pollution as a way of helping bogong moths. And post-campaign, 1 in 5 people that we surveyed in the ACT reported having undertaken action to help bogong moths, including by turning off outside lights. And finally, we also saw a 7.6% increase in the proportion of people able to link bogong moths and mountain pygmy-possums. So this was pretty good for our first year of undertaking these community-based activities, and a massive thank you to everybody who turned off a light or uploaded a moth sighting or shared any of our content on social media. It's given us plenty to build on for the summer to come and for the years ahead as well. But perhaps most importantly, and I'm sure what you're all wanting to know, is how did this all affect the mountain pygmy-possums? I'm going to pass back over to Marissa to give us the latest on the possums.
Thanks, Darcie. That's just such a wonderful story. And of course, while all of this was happening out in the community, there was a massive amount happening behind the scenes for the possums and moths as well. So under the leadership of DELP, the Mountain Pygmy-Possum Recovery Team, CMAs and other partners pulled together to develop a number of actions, and this is called our Operational Contingency Plan. It includes research to help moths, research to look into additional surveys for the mountain pygmy-possums, other ways to support the possums, and potentially new tools that we could develop to use in the future in case there's an issue like a loss of moths again or something like a catastrophic bushfire. So I'm just going to share my screen to talk you through one of the favourite projects that I was very lucky to be involved in. In fact, I was lucky to lead this project with Dr. Kim Miller up at Hillsville Sanctuary. Am I back on screen there, Darce?
You certainly are.
Thank you. And that project is bogong bickies. So we spoke with the recovery team and thought what a really nice idea would be is to come up with a new type of food that we could use out in the wild if needed, if something like a lack of bogong moths or a fire were to occur. Now at Hillsville Sanctuary 10 years ago, we analysed the fats, the proteins, the carbohydrates and vitamins and minerals of bogong moths so that we could develop our own breeding and captive diet. Now this worked well, but our bogong blend there that mimics the bogong moths was more the consistency of a butter or a caramel, so not the kind of thing you could use out in the wild. We thought what we needed to do was develop a new food that's shelf stable, baked, safe, hygienic, and can be used out in the wild. So we worked with world experts in veterinary nutrition. We partnered with Wombaroo, who are an Australian company developing new food and diet items for native species. And we developed bogong bickies and even had them commercially developed through Wombaroo. And we worked with our partners at Falls Creek and Delp and Parks Victoria. We trialled these new bickies with the possums in our care at Hillsville Sanctuary, and we had really good results. They were safe, they were popular, but the possums didn't love them. They liked them, but they didn't love them. And that was really important because out in the field, what we would like to see is the possums eating their natural food, but having the bickies there as a backup in case needed. We also, with our vet and science and keeping teams, looked at 12 different types of feeders we might be able to use out in the wild. We honed in on 4 of those feeders you can see here: a gravity feeder, an automated timed feeder, and a mesh tube, as well as a mesh parcel. All of these were safe to use with the possums. They could access the food, they were hygienic and weatherproof, and we chose the top 3 because they were going to be the easiest to use out in the field. Unfortunately, the automated feeder didn't work that well in the field because it got clogged, but the other 2 worked quite nicely. So we worked with our partners at Parks Victoria across all types of weather out in the field. This is one of the really nice days that we had out there. This is the road to our field site out past Falls Creek. This is a very smoky time. In fact, the fires were quite nearby. Of course, we all realise that over 2019 and 2020, there were major bushfires across the alpine zone. And this meant some real concerns for getting out to the possums and being able to continue this trial. Luckily, our partners from the Kiewa Valley Mount Beauty group at Parks Victoria put in a huge amount of extra work so that their rangers and our teams could get out there safely with special permission from emergency services. So we were able to keep trialling that food safely in the wild. Soon after the fires, we had major floods. This doesn't look quite as fast and deep as it was. It was quite impressive. And as we were finishing up, it was snow and hail, and the mountain is still there, you just can't see it. So we worked very hard out in the field with our bogong bickies you can see here. They're made of delicious things like nuts and oils and ground up mealworms. And everyone asks, yes, I did eat some. I have tried them. They're actually quite nice. They taste a bit like a protein bar or a health food that you'd find at a gym. I'm not going to be swapping chocolate for them anytime soon, but they are actually quite nice. And on the other side, you can see one of our gravity feeders out in the wild with a little weatherproof cap on it. This is what it looks like in our boulder fields. So you can make out our feeder here. You can just make out an infrared remote camera there. So we had 20 feeders out, all of which had cameras on them, so we could analyse who was coming, what did they do, did they eat, and we also had this nice sort of mesh over the top for safety. And the good news was that animals did come in to eat the bogong bickies. And in fact, we could recognize some of them, and they came back multiple times and across months. So the food was nice and safe. The top images here are mountain pygmy-possums, but we also had other species come in like native antechinus and the native bushrats, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. We even had mother bushrats come with juveniles in tow, which was really quite nice. So we analysed who was coming, how often they were able to get the food, did they eat it on camera, were there any interactions between species, and we didn't see anything negative there, so that was really great. It was nice and safe. We also had additional cameras across that boulder field and another 2 boulder fields near Mount Hotham, and you can see the teams from Zoos Victoria and Parks Victoria very carefully working their way through the vegetation to get those cameras back, and that was to look at the numbers of animals like ravens, cats, foxes and others to make sure that there weren't any increases around the food. And we found that there was no increase in any of these species on the boulder fields, so it was nice and safe. So we felt really positive about the trials. We're still analysing hundreds of thousands of videos and images from all of those cameras, but it was so far so good, which was great. But of course, I did mention earlier, in the middle of that were major bushfires. In the Victorian alpine zone around the mountain pygmy-possums, we were very lucky this year. None of the known populations of mountain pygmy-possums in Victoria were directly affected by the fires. Unfortunately, our partners in New South Wales weren't as lucky. And in fact, the northern Kosciuszko National Park was hit by an absolute firestorm, and 6 populations of pygmy-possums there had fire come through their habitat. And I still remember early in January, a phone call that I received from my friend and our partner, Dr. Linda Broom in New South Wales, who's worked on the possums there for decades. And she said, it's just all gone. You know, the big hope was that the possums had gone deep in the boulder fields along with other species, as they have for other fires, and they'd survived. But the vegetation and the food was gone for these animals. And this is what it looked like. So that's a picture of Linda there at her field site. You can see how badly burnt it's been. But the good news from her team was they were able to get out as soon as it was safe, and there were possums and other species that had survived. The really proud moment for Healesville Sanctuary and Zoos Victoria and me was to be able to say we have food and we have feeders that we can send you so that food can go out to these possums. And the team from New South Wales Planning, Industry and Environment, Saving Our Species, built 60 feeders, additional watering stations, and they got them out into the field. They cooked 10 kilos of bogong bickies every week, and they've been out feeding the possums ever since, doing an amazing job. And this is one of the photos that Linda sent through recently, which is a much happier, healthier and fatter possum that's looking great on the work that they've been doing with New South Wales with the bogong bickies. That's a really positive moment for us. If you want to read more about this, we did all publish a story on it together in the conversation, and we'll send that link through to everyone in an email tomorrow as a follow-up, just in case you want to have a look at it further. And it's with thanks to partners, to our donors, and to a large number of people that we're able to do this kind of work. So a really big thank you to all of those groups on the screen there who have been so involved in helping the mountain pygmy possum. And of course, there are many more people than are on the screen because all of our donors are helping us to help the mountain pygmy possums and to recover them. And if you would like to support the mountain pygmy possums, there are some links on the screen there where you can support our work and that of our partners. And if you're feeling very generous, we would love you to become one of our valued conservation partners in this program as well. So there's a second link there too. Now that's probably enough talking, but we are able to answer some questions. So I'm going to stop screen sharing now and hand over to Darcie, see if any of our listeners have sent through some questions for us tonight. Darcie, do we have any questions to answer?
We certainly do, thank goodness. I think it's a speaker's worst nightmare if no questions come through, but we've got plenty. So, Marissa, this is a good question for you, and it's come from Ben. Do you think that mountain pygmy possums could be taken off the endangered species list one day? And if so, what would it take?
That's a really good question, Ben, and I'm an eternal optimist. We work with amazing partners who are doing a huge amount of work. So what we all want to see is our endangered species like mountain pygmy possums coming off the endangered species list and being safe in the wild for the future. So the team has long-term focuses to try and increase the numbers of possums, the amount of habitat available, and the safety of the possums out in the wild. So I think one day we could do it. We could certainly take them off the critically endangered list, hopefully start moving down through that list to have them safer out in the wild. And I think it's a really great thing to focus on the future and the work that we can all do together, because everyone can make a difference for these species.
That's right. And we always have to have hope.
We do.
And another
Absolutely.
question here from Nicole about one of my favourite projects, the Tunnel of Love. Nicole has asked, did you find that the tunnel was successful in letting the males go up and down the mountain?
Excellent. That's a really nice question. And yes, there was a huge amount of work done from our partners at Mount Hotham. So they've been reviewing the footage and looking at the little microchip scanners. And so they have found that males are using that tunnel, as well as some other species too. So that's not the only tunnel out there. There have been other tunnels built at places like Mount Buller, and a famous one built in the past at Mount Hotham that has been really successful. So it's still early days, but it's looking good so far. So some really exciting things for the future there.
Excellent. That's good to hear. I think we might have time for two more quick questions. One from Georgie. Georgie has asked, is genetic diversity still a major concern for this species' long-term recovery? Are there translocation programs between all populations and captive bred possums?
That's a great question, Georgie, and it's something that I didn't go into because it's quite a long answer, so I'll try and give you a short answer here. And early on, back in the 2000s, a main focus of the recovery team started being the genetic diversity, and that's continued through. So at Hillsville Sanctuary, we started a program to look at whether we could breed possums from different populations and have those more genetically healthy possums to go out in the wild. And we showed that, yes, you can do that. You can mix those populations to help out some that don't have as good genetics. The recovery team, Mount Buller and the University of Melbourne then did an amazing job taking possums across from Mount Hotham to perform what they call a genetic rescue in the wild. And that's been really successful. To that, we also added 13 possums that I spoke about with our release from captivity. And the team, led by Melbourne Uni, has shown that they have increased the genetic diversity and they have increased the health of those possums. So that's a really exciting project, and that's one that can continue for possums in the future to have the healthiest populations that we can have.
That's a brilliant example of zoo-based conservation. And speaking of breeding, Marissa, you've told me this earlier, but I've forgotten the answer already. How many babies can a mountain pygmy possum have in its lifetime?
In its lifetime, so they can have up to 4 every year, and the average number in a litter is generally about 3.6. So most females will have 3 to 4 young, and then it depends how long the females live for. So they start breeding as 1 year old, and they generally have 1 litter every year. So if they live for 4 years, for example, they could have up to 16 young. If they live for longer, they could have more. In captivity, we very carefully regulate who breeds with who to make sure we maintain the best genetics possible, but we have had some females have multiple litters of young there too. So they can have quite a few young in their lifetime, but it depends just how long they live for.
Pretty productive little things. And a question come in from Naomi. She's asked about Moth Tracker and asked if it will be available this year. So glad you asked this question, Naomi. Yes, it most definitely will be. So Moth Tracker isn't actually an app, it's a web page. It's free and really easy for anyone to access. All you have to do on Moth Tracker when you've sighted a moth is to upload a picture of what you've seen, indicate how many animals you think you've seen, give us your geolocation and just your first name. And that way we can record your sighting and we can share it as open source data. So definitely it will be back this year, and stay tuned because Zoos Victoria will be focusing on that in the coming months, likely from September onwards for the bogong moth migration period. And one last question, Marissa. What is it that you are most excited about coming up in the future?
There's quite a lot I'm excited about for mountain pygmy-possums, and I think there's just so much happening with our partners out there in the wild with DELP and Parks Victoria. But I think for me, analysing the last of those videos and images from the bogong bicky trial so that we have all the information possible and we know it can be a useful tool to have in our toolkit for the future. I think knowing that we have a few different things and we're ready in case there is another fire or a lack of bogong moths is really exciting. So I'm very excited about the bogong bickies. How about you, Darcie? What are you excited for in the future?
Oh, lots of things, but I think specifically for mountain pygmy-possums and bogong moths, I'm really excited for the next iteration of Moth Tracker and finding out even more from our citizen scientists across Southeastern Australia what's out there. It's an incredibly exciting thing to get people outside and looking for moths, which, potentially are species that people don't usually get excited and active about. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes in on Moth Tracker in the next season. And I'm also really, really looking forward to raising the profile of light pollution and raising awareness about the impacts that light pollution can have on so many different species of wildlife, not just migrating bogong moths, and working together with lots of other great organisations who are already working in this space, because of course everything that we do at Zoos Victoria is in collaboration with our partners, and the more the better. We couldn't do any of what we do without other organisations and individuals that we work with. So pairing up with more experts in that space and getting the word out there about light pollution and what we can all do to reduce its impacts is a really, really exciting space for me.
I think that's a great answer to end on, actually, thanking all of our partners, our donors, and of course everyone who did log moths on Moth Tracker, everyone who turned lights off. When done en masse, we can all make a real difference for animals, even as far away as mountain pygmy-possums. So a big thank you to everyone who's tuned in tonight for our first Conservation Conversations webinar. I hope everyone's enjoyed it and enjoyed seeing the possums. And of course, if anyone is happy to support us, we'd love to welcome you as a conservation partner, and that information will be up on the screen shortly. So have a wonderful night, and we hope to see you next week as well. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.